Does anybody have a problem with me not having a mask on?
No.
That's not a mask?
Well, there might be a few people kind of coming in. I wanted to say from the beginning that I rely very, very heavily on this author. His name is Kenneth Bailey. He actually is a Lutheran in background, but what I have found compelling about his exegesis of the teachings of Jesus is that he has spent 30 years of his life, a number of those years actually living in Israel, but actually tracking down in many different cultures, not simply Palestinian culture, but but Middle Eastern culture, traditional culture, small villages. And what he has found is that because, you know, societies like Western societies have an entirely different cycle because you have all of the inventions that literally change the society over time. But traditional societies tend to hold on to things, and what is, because they're closely knit, they don't function so much differently than they may have even in Jesus' time. And so there are mores and cultural customs and ways of looking at things that are quite coherent. And then when you add your research into some of the laws back then and some of the practices, or even some of the people that wrote commentaries, you find that many times they were looking at things in a certain way. And I find that what they do is they bring out the teachings of Jesus actually even in, they're richer. They don't change necessarily what it's saying, but they are. And so what I'd like to do is just acknowledge this, because I will be talking a lot about, I will function with a, I am using this. The parable that we're going to look at, and I would invite you to take a look at the scripture, because I will be asking some questions just for you to help in terms of just what do you notice kind of questions. It starts on chapter 12 of Luke.
Can everybody hear okay?
Oh, yeah,
Is this on?
yeah, you gotta turn it on. I was just waiting for you to
Oh,
be
yeah,
ready.
we're late. Wait a minute now. Yeah, it did. Well, I think I had it on, but it's. Okay.
Yeah, I could. I was going to say I could project my voice. So if we would look at chapter 12 of Luke, and we're going to, there's a little intro that I'll say something about, but then it's a parable that Jesus tells, and what I find when he takes me, and I just mentioned Kenneth Bailey is the book. It's called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. And but when he breaks the parables and the teachings of Jesus down, I'm struck by how carefully worded they are, how succinct, and how oftentimes they suggest a lot. And if you were a hearer, you would be hearing some of these things. So I'll read this through, and then we'll kind of walk it through with some questions that get at the picture that Jesus is painting in this parable. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And then he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God.'" Of course, this parable has legs, because we have that expression in our society, building bigger barns. A word about the situation, because it's very terse. And you're thinking, what Jesus, he says in this translation, "friend," but I think it's really "man," and it's kind of meant as suggesting a little displeasure at what the guy is asking. What he's demanding, and this is the way the author puts it together. In Jesus' time, the rabbi was the lawyer. And you didn't have sacred secular, everything was sacred. The rabbi would often adjudicate legal issues. What appears to be the case here is you have an aggrieved brother not asking Jesus, but telling him, as a rabbi, to tell his brother to divide up the property. So the situation would be probably as follows. The father has not left an oral or a written will. The laws would state then that the oldest brother could not be divided unless the older brother agreed. So this would be probably a younger brother. He is already in, obviously, controversy with his older brother. And the author makes the observation, which I realize we can probably relate to now, is generally, if you are on the side of justice, the tendency is you don't think there's anything wrong with the way you see it. Habakkuk actually puts it this way in one of his sentences. He says, "Their justice and self-worth proceeds from themselves, as if no justice was above their own view." So what this guy is demanding is justice. Jesus is a reconciler, not an adjudicator. This person is not coming in here saying, "My brother and I have disagreement. Can you help us to adjudicate something so that we can live at peace?" He wants him, and he points out that nobody ever gets Jesus to do something by ordering them to do it so that they take a side that is going to go with the self-interest of that person. Jesus is not going to bite on that, and his answer back is a little bit displeasure. "Man, who set me to be a judge and arbiter over you?" And then this would be probably a clue to what he thinks is going on here. He's asking them to take a bigger look at the picture here. And he's really teaching the crowd. "Take care," he says, "be on your guard against all kinds of greed." And here would be the principle. "For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." If you thought about that for a bit, and I realized that advertisers obviously are trying to get you to buy a product. But do you notice how often the appeal is suggested that if you buy this product, your life will be better. It will be better, not just simply in convenience, but often they'll use even theological or philosophical words. I wish I had some, I don't know if any of you can think about it, where it's actually your soul, your life, your happiness. And then of course you see all of the pictures of people having had the product, and now they're going out to the new day, and that kind of a thing. But the point is that it's easy to believe that, especially in our society. Maybe as we get older, we begin to see through it. But I think we've all thought, what would life be like if I was fantastically rich and could buy anything I wanted? Have you ever thought that? Of course. I've come to the point now where I look at it and say, no, I kind of like it the way it is. Because there are all, when you start getting you start understanding behind the scenes stories of people that have made it famous or rich or something, oftentimes there's a great deal of tragedy and unhappiness. So it does, but anyway, that's not where we're going to spend most of the time. In this short little parable, you have basically goods are given to the man. It's an incredible harvest. He has a dialogue with himself about what am I going to do with all this because I don't have enough room. He comes up with a solution, which is to build bigger barns. Then he has a dialogue with himself about what the meaning of this is going to be for his life. And then he dies, and you end up having the question, now where do the goods go? And then you end up having the general principle. And so you end up having it told in this way. What I would like to suggest here is that let's just take a look at verse. We'll start with a parable here. And that would be second half of 16. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. Notice the way that is phrased. It's not the rich man produced. He happens to be on land, and it produces abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Any thoughts about what's missing in this from his perspective, or from the perspective of what Jesus is telling? Because Jesus is painting a picture here.
The community.
Absolutely. It was Augustine who said he did not realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than his barns. You have a and there's another thing, and maybe we see it more clearly in verse 18, and I want you to look. This is what he's going to do. This is his solution, and I want you to take a look And just read it. I'll read it out loud, but think about it. And here's an ask. I'd like to have you, what do you notice about it? It's worded very carefully. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Yeah.
I think there's some confusion as to where we're
Where
at.
are we?
Oh,
What book are
I am very, very sorry. This is Luke chapter 12, and this is verse 16. And then I guess I went to 17. I'm sorry. Then I was 18. Yeah, it was verse 18. I'm sorry. Are we good now?
And we'll stay in 12.
We'll stay in 12.
Okay. Thank you.
What do you notice about the wording of the conversation he has with himself? My, I. And this is one of the things I find fascinating, and it's only something that commentators have put it on, but when you see it constructed that way, it's carrying a very deliberate meaning. People said, where was the community? Notice that his solution right now is entirely self. My barns, my crops, I will. Now here's an interesting thing from traditional Middle Eastern villages that the author points out. He says, and of course some people like to get out of this, but he says that in a traditional Middle Eastern village, your business is everybody else's business, and nobody makes a decision without talking about it endlessly at the city gate or somewhere. I mean, that's what you do. Sometimes even the smallest things that you're going to do, you're talking about it because you got your families, your uncles, everybody knows everybody's business, and you're talking about it. What's fascinating here is the absence of anybody. Now that's pretty atypical. So let's look at it perhaps even a little deeper. And I'm wrong here. You don't have to turn to Isaiah chapter 5. I said you didn't have to move, but let me just read it. One of the things that was falling apart when the prophets arose and spoke to power was that in the way in which the promised land was originally apportioned, you ended up having every family with a place where they could earn a living. You also had the safeguard, as it was pointed out last week, of Jubilee. We don't know in what way that was, or if it was actually celebrated, but the idea was debts are canceled, you go back to what it is. The intent here is to keep the society stable, rather than have everything accrue to those who are either much smarter with their stuff, or they're just fortunate and didn't have big illnesses and stuff like that. Here is the critique of Isaiah to the society that is starting to fragment. Ah, you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. You see how this one would go. You have all of these plots, but somebody is in debt, and you move things in such a way that you now acquire that family's, and they become landless. And if you're quite powerful, you begin to acquire a bunch of pieces of land, and pretty soon you own all of that. Now, how do the rest of the people make their living? Working for you, day laborers. And that's, remember some of Jesus' parables, you come and the day laborers are waiting. Because you pay them 1 denarii, and that's what they got to buy food for their families. So you end up having some of these things. That's the setting here. Now, notice the picture that Jesus is painting of this rich man. He's rich, so you already know he probably has a lot of land. What was it that went on for that to be? You see a little bit of an insight into it. Remember that story about Ahab and Jezebel and the vineyard? How many of you remember that? I'll tell that very quickly. It's a great story because Ahab is walking through his land, and he starts noticing that the land that adjoins his, Ahab's the king, is an awfully well-kept thing. Beautiful vineyards. So he goes to the owner and says, "I'd like to buy it from you." And the owner says, "Well, I can't sell it. This is my family. This is my children, my children's children. I mean, this is mine in trust." So Ahab goes home and pouts. Now his wife, who is not a Jew at all, but from, I think, Tyre maybe, kingdom of Tyre, you know. Anyway, she's quite a schemer, and she says, "You just eat and I'll take care of everything." And she does. She bribes some people to make some false charges against him. He is taken to court, sentenced to death, and now now this vineyard is there, and Elijah shows up, and Ahab's first question to him is, "You troubler of Israel." And Elijah will have none of that because he said, "No, you're the troubler." But he's walking through this, that he used the leverage of dishonest power to get. I think it's reflective of what the prophets are saying was happening in the society. It happens in all kinds of societies. And so what we have here is, yes, there's the absence of community, and he's having a dialogue with himself. Nobody else. What is also, do you notice in his... Let me just read that parable again and just see other things that you might notice in the way in which this is told. Then he told him this parable, verse 16. "The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, 'What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.'" Any echoes of anything that you hear here? We laugh. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, it's an Epicurean phrase, and Paul uses it. He adds, "You'll die."
Yeah, the phrase in Ecclesiastes, and we've kind of adopted it in our culture sometimes, "Eat, drink, and be merry before tomorrow we die." Notice that he only quotes the first half. Eat, drink, and be merry. What is his idea of the good life? He is using the word soul. Now in Hebrews, you don't have the Greek separation of soul and body. You're one person. So you're really saying to your body and soul, You have stuff stored up forever. Eat, drink, and be merry. What is his conception of what the good life means?
Not working,
Not working,
having stuff.
having stuff,
Good food and good drink,
good food and good drink,
I say living it up.
living it up,
parties.
party. I'm not sure who he parties with, but
That's one of the things that's not with it.
yeah, it's an entirely a self-orbiting person. It's really cut off from all relationships. They just don't even enter in. He talks to his soul, but what does not appear to even be part of the equation for his soul at all, at least in this conversation as it's being presented? Eternal life. Others.
A relationship with God?
A relationship with God. It is as though this does not exist, and what he has now come across is he has found the meaning of life by having so much that he doesn't have to work. Notice what he also doesn't do. Obviously, a rich man building bigger barns is not building them himself. So none of this is going to the employees. So he's a person that it isn't even occurring to him that maybe there's something like justice or sharing or rewarding his employees for helping him or anything else. It's just completely about what he's getting for himself, and his life is confined basically to what he eats, drinks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's just a total absence of gratitude.
Yeah. Total absence of gratitude.
Not like grateful that he has this land or that,
Yeah.
whatever, the fortune, good weather.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah. An absence of gratitude. So we're building. See, what we're doing is Jesus is painting a picture where if you're thinking about it, you're starting to see a philosophy of life. Now, one of the things that the author observed, and I don't know if you have observed this or how he does, I'm sure it's not scientific, but he has observed this, that all around the world, there is a tendency, and maybe this is because people who are very wealthy don't know who their real friends are, so you have to vet everything, and then you create, but he notices that generally speaking, people of great wealth move away from community and increasingly are isolated, except the extreme, of course, was Howard Hughes, but that was probably, mental situation as well, mental illness, but there tends to be a moving away from community, and when you move away from community, what happens to your sensitivities to the community? It becomes less and less. So there's a dynamic where if you're thinking only about yourself, that may be the process that happened in the course of the decisions that were made. Where it begins to blind you. You don't see. And so you have to wonder, is this man really living the full life? If you're a listener in Jesus' time to this parable, you're probably quite struck by the isolation, by the lack of community that you would expect, by the natural concerns for if you have so much, why wouldn't you share it with somebody? Why wouldn't you do something that would benefit the community? All of those natural questions don't seem to occur to this person. So now we get set up for the other half of the quote. And I will say to myself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Of course, when this is translated into Greek, you would have Greeks do think of body and soul. So we would tend to see it as soul in the way we're shaped with things. Now you get God in here for the first time. But God said to him, you fool. Maybe you can help me out a little bit here, Philip. My understanding of fool in the Bible is a person that lacks all wisdom of life and doesn't see any sense of relationship to God. And that inherently takes a person in the wrong direction. Notice no gratitude, and oftentimes what goes along with no gratitude is no accountability. I am not accountable for my life. I'm not accountable for how I use my property. I'm not accountable for anything. It's just about what satisfies me. And in the process of doing that, he is diminished. So that the very things that everybody knows are so rich with life, relationships, generosity, all kinds of things, he has isolated himself and he thinks this is as good as it gets. So then we end up this very knife, your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. One of the questions then that you would ask is, what does it mean to be rich toward God? Jesus often speaks of store up treasures in heaven. It's an interesting image, isn't it? I mean, it's one that isn't it's not a logical statement, but it is a way of speaking. In what way does a person become rich toward God? It's just a question. It's not like there's here's the answer. It's kind of your thoughts that would occur to you from a biblical perspective. Yeah.
Well, the antithesis of that, or the opposite of that, would be what I see Jeff Bezos doing. When I grew up, my mom would say, I'd give you the moon with a fence around it if I could. Jeff Bezos is achieving that, but then somebody had to tell him, I think, I achieved this because of all the people that buy from me. I mean, his statement after he came back from being in outer space. So I really see this as being a.
What was his statement when he came back? Because I didn't hear.
His statement was, all the people. I have to thank all the employees of Amazon and all the people who buy from me for me being able to accomplish this. So there he's thinking about community.
That's really refreshing.
Right, but I think that statement says, I mean, let's put it in context with this, he's still thinking about himself.
Yes.
But he's thinking about the community that made himself possible. I mean, in business, if you want to be successful, you have to be willing to use people.
Yes.
I mean, you should pay them, but if you can get by without paying them, that means you're going to be more wealthy.
Right.
So, these are just the thoughts that have come out as you've been talking.
Yes.
I don't know if it connects at all.
Well, no, I think it does. I mean, this human tendency to be captured by greed is is age-old, and you have philosophers weighing in from more traditions than simply Judeo-Christian. And it's part of that danger, because what happens is the one who's captured by greed often doesn't realize they're greedy. But their actions are such that they're able to gather up a tremendous amount of riches, but they're not thinking about what would be my obligation, or am I accountable for this? And yes,
I think in our culture, we have, kind of understanding the sort of self-made, mostly self-made.
self-made, yes.
Typically, somebody's done really well in business or something else, and then feels like everything, something he or she has earned totally themselves. I'm thinking they have parents, they have teachers, and they got educated, they were traveling on roads, they have, the culture and the society has built all sorts of things, but because they've been successful, they think it's all, here.
Yes, and I know that David Brooks, I don't know if he coined this phrase or if he got it from somebody else, probably got it for us, but he talks about our culture is hyper-individualistic. And I think when a culture moves in that direction, then your accountability, you might say, or your obligation, or even your gratitude to all of the things that have allowed you then to be in a position to be successful, you don't tend to see, because it's all about you. So, you know, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, why are we in this health crisis? Because our own personal responsibility is only to ourselves. But your question about how do we build up riches with heaven, with God, I think, as reflecting on what we're saying, it's about service.
Yes.
It's about doing God's work here, about building that relationship of sharing love.
I think this is actually a huge question. One of the things that just kind of blew my mind, I don't know philosophy hardly at all. There's a French philosopher named Foucault. I don't think, did I pronounce that right? I'm always intimidated by French, always. But he, who is not a believer, kind of astonished Michael Root when he was in a lecture where he basically said that what collided in early Western civilization was a view of leadership that was Greco-Roman, which was the leader, everybody exists for the leader. In many ways, it was just like our friend in Iraq. Remember, how many palaces did he have? 50? I mean, you know, it's like it all goes to you, and then anything that makes you greater, and then you kind of beat all of these people that aren't doing what they need. The one that prevailed, he would argue, actually comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a shepherd. And the shepherd is effective as a leader insofar as they are able to provide and lead the sheep. That's actually, so we even have words like minister, which means table waiter, we call Prime Minister of England. I mean, we even have it in our language. We have it embedded in ways we don't even realize that, and that's not saying everybody operates that way, but you do have this thought structure in which there's this sense of when you have power, or at least through government, you have an obligation to how that power is used for the common good. And I think that one of the dangers, and I think that Jesus is showing that one of the dangers is when we morph out of that into hyper-individualism, we start forgetting in our way of thinking We think that we're all a bunch of cowboys in the frontier, and we're really not accountable to much unless we have to fight a war. And reality is there are a tremendous amount of ways in which we're connected, and that part of the vocation of the Christian is to say, as Martin Luther saw, he said, if you're a barber, then you're a barber, and you're benefiting the community, and you're giving of yourself, and you're the best barber you can be, and you're seeing it in terms of a larger purpose of loving neighbor. Other comments? These are, yes.
Some time ago, I was reading Isaiah, and I was reading about his comments about care for the poor, and then I saw that at the time that this was being dispersed by the scribes, the poor constituted 97% of Israel, and so the audience was the poor. By the time you get to the Gospels, the poor were still 95%, and it makes me wonder about the audience for this as well. In the 1980s, there were amazing things that I've lost, but there were, maybe you remember, there were a group of women in El Salvador who went out and they were doing ministry during the day, and they were doing their Bible reading backwards. We would start the day, I start my day looking for guidance and where the Spirit is going to lead me. They would gather together after a day of spending time with the poor, after their struggles, and they would read, generally, I think it was a psalm, and the insights they came up with were so amazing to me, ways that I would have never, ever thought. Is this stuff written, some people have said, when you're reading the Bible, you're reading somebody else's mail. The society was so different. What changes in this if you see this being read or heard by somebody who is profoundly poor compared to us in our time who are really affluent and very well off?
Yeah. Did everybody hear that? And all I can say is, I think one of the things that's been enriching in the last few years is sometimes people look at the society, archaeology from different points of view, like socioeconomic. And what I understand to be the case in Jesus' time under the Roman Empire was that it was basically a kind of a pyramid thing. 40% are slaves. And then you have the vast number of the poor, day laborers, which is one of the meanings of the word that's translated carpenter. Jesus could be a day laborer. The point was, you just got by, but then you were oppressed by the taxes for all of the things that were up here. So it also was I'm blanking on the word, benefactor culture. You would look to the person better off to you to try to get in good with them because they might be able to benefit you. This is one of the reasons when Jesus says, when you invite people to your house, invite the people that can't repay you. I mean, he's suggesting something when you're doing in the opposite. But I think that there's a real strong sense that the people of the land, whom the Pharisees tended to look down on because half the time they couldn't even afford to keep all of these rules, the people of the land really, a lot of them really got Jesus. And they loved him. The people that were in control were worried about the political ramifications of this guy they couldn't control. And so you can understand that's an age-old story. But I think yes, I think that people that were very, very poor. And that's one of the reasons why people, and I was reading, there were a lot of people that just couldn't make it and they became bandits in Jesus' time. And of course, if they were ever caught, they were crucified. I mean, that was just part of the deal. But it was a hard life. So when Jesus is talking about don't worry about the future, wow. I mean, that's a radical word because there's a lot of future to worry about. Hey, you know what? I'm looking at 25 after, but thanks, yes.
Well, if you read verse 10 and relate it to this parable, it says, and everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. So we can say anything we want against Jesus Christ, right? That's an impression I'm giving you. But whoever blasphemies against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. And then I jump down then to the verse, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. So is that a demand, you're being blasphemous against the Holy Spirit, so you're losing your...
I don't think one can carry that very far, because then you really bump into the very nature of grace. And, even you think about the person on the cross that's dying with Jesus, and he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Who knows what that history was?
Right.
It's been interpreted, because it's a scary one, and I remember as a pastor, this guy, I think he was depressed and obsessing, but he came in just tormented that he had sinned against the Holy Spirit and couldn't be forgiven. And I couldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So we don't want to go there. I think it has to do with what happens to you when you are rejecting, and not listening to the very things that can save you. You can get to the point, I pointed this out, that it's very difficult to imagine that Adolf Hitler, when he put the gun to his head, might have had a moment where he decided to confess his sins to God. I think that he traveled so far down the road of rejecting that it was inconceivable for him. It wouldn't even enter his mind. I think that's what it means, because otherwise it gets to be very troubling. Because then you're trying to say, well, was that a sin against the Holy Spirit? I think what they were saying is Jesus is, when you're saying Jesus is from the devil, where do you go with that? If the Spirit is with Jesus and you're saying he's of the devil, it seems to me that, Phil, this is... Nobody's come up with a great answer, but I have to go because I have to preach a sermon.
But you say, look at the time.
Yeah, look at the time. It's always important. It's always a relief when a pastor will say, look at the time. No, thank you. And next week we're going to do another a parable. This is the very famous one of Lazarus, which even more so, I was struck by, if you put the picture together, it's really, really fascinating. So anyway, see you next week.